Okay, welcome to this seminar today, extra seminar of the Logic and Philosophy seminar in CEFISES, last one for this year. And it's a great pleasure to have Nils Kürbis here from the University of Bochum, the RUB University, and he will be talking about definite descriptions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm particularly happy to be speaking from the Bertrand Russell room. It's very fitting because I will speak a lot about Russell today. Okay, good, so here goes. So, a definite description is an expression of the form VF. So something like the first man on the moon, the author of Principia Mathematica, the world's most famous detective. So the expression VF purports to refer to a unique object that answers to the description. If there's exactly one F, then we say that the definite description DF is proper, and if not, we say it is improper. So for instance, the first man on the moon, that is improper because there's one and only one person answering to the description, Neil Armstrong. The author of Principia Mathematica is improper because it's a joint work by Russell and Whitehead. And the world's most famous detective is improper because Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. So he had a couple of examples, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And here is the great Bertrand Russell, in whose room we are here today. So Russell, of course, had, well, probably the most famous theory of definite description has been put forward by Russell, and often when people speak about the theory of definite description, they use a definite article, the theory of definite descriptions, to refer to Russell's theory. So the definite article, the, seems to be a term-forming operator. It takes a complex or a simple predicate f and forms a singular term out of it. And VF then takes a further predicate or further singular terms and a relational expression to form a sentence. So for instance, the F is G, or A is R to the F, and so on. According to Russell, though, that's only apparent. Definite descriptions should be treated in the context of sentences in which they occur, and they disappear upon analysis. So, according to Russell's famous analysis, the sentence, the present King of France is bald, means exactly one person is present King of France, and he's bald. And VF is G is analyzed in, as there is exactly one F, and it is G, and in symbols, you've got the famous Russellian formalization of the sentence, there is an X, such that it is the unique F, that's the first conjunct, and it is G, that's the second conjunct. So that's Russell's famous theory of definite descriptions. What Russell then does is to define an expression iota xf by a contextual definition, which requires means for drawing scope distinctions. So what we need to do is to distinguish the internal negation from the external negation of, for instance, Russell's example, the present King of France is bald. Because they, of course, differ in truth conditions. The present King of France is not bald, is false, simply because there's no such person as the King of France, the present King of France, whereas it is not the case that the present King of France is bald is true, because it isn't the case that there's a unique person who's King of France and bald. What Russell does is to mark the scope of definite descriptions by repeating the definite description itself in square brackets. So here we've got an example, square brackets iota xf, not g iota xf, unpacks. There is an x, such that x is the unique f and it is not g, so the negation is applied to the predicate g, whereas 2, the sentence 2, the external negation of the present King of France is bald, is formalized as it is not the case, square brackets f iota xf, g of iota xf, and that unpacks as it is not the case that there's a unique f and it is g, here the negation is applied to the complete sentence, the complete formula. It's just coincidentally, Russell's notation is almost universally considered to be suboptimal. So, for instance, I mean, ask yourself, when was the last time you saw anyone using it? Of course, now you just saw someone using it as me. So, ask yourself, when was the last time you saw someone using Russell's methods for drawing scope distinctions when people were not explaining Russell? Yeah? So no one uses that. So it's not ideal notation. So one thing I'm going to do today is to propose better notation. It is standard to formalize definite descriptions with a time-forming operator iota. So iota then binds a variable and forms a singular term from an open formula. That is the method it's originally due to Peano. It was used by Whitehead and Russell, Hilbert and Bernays, Hintecker and Lambert, Van Fraassen and others. It's really the standard way of formalizing definite descriptions. But there is an alternative method which goes back to Russell's original idea. What we do is we formalize complete sentences in which definite descriptions occur in one go. The FSG is then formalized by a binary quantifier I that binds a variable and takes two open formulas to form a formula. So Ix square brackets f comma g is then the formalization of the FSG. So this takes on Russell's idea that definite descriptions only appear to be singular terms and have meaning only in the context of complete sentences. It also takes on the idea that definite descriptions are quantificational devices, which is a view that one finds in the philosophy of language, and we'll see that scope distinctions are very clearly represented immediately in the notation as part of it. So the notation, there are three good reasons to adopt this notation. On the other hand, I've given you Peano, Whitehead and Russell, Hilbert and Bernays, Hintecker and Lambert, Van Fraassen and others, so I'm up against some big names, but I will still insist on my notation. Okay, so here's a plan of the talk. I'll give you an overview over some options of rules of inference that I've come up with in natural deduction for the binary quantifier. First of all, there are rules that stay very close to Neil Tennant's system for intuitionistic free logic with a term-forming iota operator. I'll give you then rather complicated rules for positive free logic, which are motivated by saying very little about improper definite descriptions. And then I give you greatly simplified rules for positive free logic. 2 and 3 are then a contribution to formalizing new theories of definite descriptions. And at the end, if there's time, I can present the rules for the secant calculus too. But what I'll do in the end is give you brief considerations of how to change my rules in point 3 to be suitable to modal logic, which is quite an interesting problem. So when I speak about INF, that's intuitionistic negative free logic, IPF is intuitionistic positive free logic, and CNF and CPF are their classical versions. So here is just a reminder of how rules for the quantifiers work in free logic. In free logic, the quantifiers are restricted to an existence predicate, or a predicate that states that the term refers. So in order to introduce for all x a, I'm assuming that a exists and deduce, or that parametrically used, I'm using a parametrically reused variable is assumed to have the predicate of existence, and then I deduce that that variable also gives me the formula a, that it has the property a, then I'm allowed to introduce all x a. Okay, this was a bit convoluted, but I think you see the idea. In the existential quantifier elimination rule, in order to deduce that T is an A, I need to assume that T exists. Okay, so I can only conclude from all x A that T is an A if T actually exists in the range, is in the range of the quantifier. And similarly for the existential quantifier, I can only deduce there is an x A if I know that the term T refers and T is supposed to be an A. And similarly then again for the existential quantifier elimination. Identity, the theory of identity in positive free logic is totally standard. So we've got the law of self-identity and Leibniz law. In negative free logic, identity is conditional on the existence of T. So I can only conclude that T equals T if T exists. And what's characteristic of negative free logic is this rule I'm calling after Neil Tennant atomic denotation. Atomic proposition can only be true or assertable if all terms in it refer. So if I've got an atomic proposition R, T1 to Tn, then I can conclude that Ti exists for any I between 1 and n. And here then are the rules for the binary quantifier in intuitionistic negative free logic. Here's the introduction rule. If I know that f is a T, it is also a G, and it exists, and the rightmost part of the deduction tells me that T is the unique F, then I can conclude that the F is G. So the F is G can be concluded if T, I know of some T that it is the unique existing F that is G. And the elimination rule, fast elimination rule, is basically just like existential quantifier elimination. So if the f is G, and I know of something that is an f, G, and it exists, and I deduce certain things under certain conditions, then I can conclude these certain things under those conditions. So that's just existential quantifier elimination. And then there's the second elimination rule, which is a little bit more complicated, but basically what that tells you is that if the f is G, oh sorry, there's a typo actually, the iota here should be a capital I. If the f is G, then if I know that T1 exists, that T2 exists, and that both T1 and T2 are f's, then I also can conclude that T1 equals T2. So the reason why there's an atomic A here is basically there's an application of Leibniz law built into that rule. And the reason for that is just that it's proof theoretically nicer. Okay? So, but think about it this way. Forget about the rightmost A in the premises and conclude T1 equals T2 from the f is G, T1 and T2 exist, and they are both in F. Okay, so if the f is G, then there's exactly one existing F. And so if I know that T1 and T2 are Fs, they must be identical. That's the idea. So basically you can see already that the rules here built into, Russell's analysis is built into these rules very precisely. So consider now adding my rules for the binary quantifier to intrinsic negative free logic. Then we get the following. If the f is G, I can deduce that there is an f, it is the only f, and it is G. I can also conclude the converse. If there is an f, and it's the only f, and it is G, then the f is G. I can conclude that if the f is identical to T, and T has a certain property G, then the f is G. I have the following formula here, which basically tells you that if A is the f, if X is the A, if Y, anything Y is the A, if and only if it is the unique A. Yeah, that's what some important principles for definite descriptions, as we'll see, that we can deduce. I can also deduce that if T exists, then the T is the T, and deductions normalize in my system. So 1 and 2, of course, they capture Russell's analysis of the f is G. So that's why the approach here is totally Brazilian. 3, invariance thereof, they show us that we can operate with expressions the f is G as we would with terms in Leibniz law. Okay, so there are a couple of other variations, but we can all deduce them to hold. 4 is an analog to what's called Lambert's axiom. So when Lambert proposed free logic in the early 60s, when he proposed theories of definite descriptions for free logic, he added this axiom to formalize a minimal theory of definite descriptions, and we can see that so that's an important principle for definite descriptions, Lambert's axiom, and you can see that in my system something very similar can be deduced. 5 is an analog for negative free logic that is Lambert's second axiom. So Lambert prefers positive free logic, but he has a second axiom for his favorite theory of definite descriptions, and 5 is an analog for that in negative free logic. And 6 is just a desirable proof theoretic property. So here's now now let's compare my system with something more standard. So Tenon gives the following formalization for the iota operator, the time-forming operator, in terms of rule of inference. If T exists, and the other two deductions tell you that T is the unique F, then the F equals T. Okay, so that's the introduction rule for the iota operator according to Tenon. And the elimination rules look like this. Okay, what exactly they mean? Well, if the F equals T and U is identical to T, then it must be an F, because T, of course, if it is the F, is an F, and if U equals T, then U is an F. If the F equals T, and we know that F is a U, and U exists, then I can conclude that U must be identical to T. Okay? Because again, T is the unique F. If something else is an F, say U, and it exists, then U must be identical to T. And the third rule is basically just a special case of the rule of atomic denotation. If the F is T, it's identical to T, then T must exist. Okay, so because atomic propositions in negative free logic can be true only if all terms in them refer. So basically what this does is to put Lambert's, okay, here we've got this again, Lambert's axiom in line 4, or in point 4, Lambert's axiom, it puts Lambert's axiom into rule form. That's what Tennant did here. And now we can compare my system of the binary quantifier with Tennant's system. There's quite a clear, so a direct comparison isn't possible because, of course, I have scope distinctions in my system, so the binary quantifier allows me to draw the distinction between internal and external negation, so I can, for instance, write down negation IXFG, external negation, and I can write down IXF negation G, internal negation. In Tennant's system, there's only one formula, G of iota XF. So we cannot compare them directly, but there's a very clear correspondence. So consider the following restriction. Let G always be an identity flanked by a constant or parameter. Okay, so we're restricting G to identity, and then on the other side of the identity is a constant or parameter, and we call these two INF IR and INF iota R. What this does is to restrict INF I quite dramatically because, I can only speak about statements of identity involving definite descriptions, but not very much is lost in INF iota R compared to INF iota. Because recall that the rules for iota do not say anything about how to operate with formulas G of iota fx in general. They only tell us what to do if G is an identity. And all the rules, so this is a fact that I'm not going to prove, but this is not too difficult to prove. I've done this in another paper. All rules but iota, the third elimination, Tennant's third elimination rule, all these rules can be restricted to occurrences where T, to applications where T is a term that is not a definite description. Okay, so a variable, say a parameter, or a constant parameter or a constant. So all of these three rules, except from the third elimination rule, can be restricted so that T is a parameter or constant. And so we don't really restrict the system INF iota, and the third elimination rule of Tennant is just a special case of the rule of atomic denotation, because we don't need the third rule anyway. And so here you've got a sketch of the proof of this theorem. So roughly speaking, if I can prove that A follows from gamma in INF IR, then that's the case if and only if a certain translation of the formulas in gamma and A are so if I can prove that the translations of these formulas derive the translation of the conclusion A in INF iota R, where tau works like this. It translates IX square brackets F comma X equals T as iota XF equals T. So basically what we do is we translate VF is T as VF is T. So this is quite straightforward. And roughly speaking, we have this relation between these two systems. So again, a rough sketch of the proof is that Tennant's rules are just Lambert's axiom in rule form, and the formula that translates Lambert's axiom under tau is derivable in INFI. That was my point 4 above when I compared my two, when I spoke about what the formulas are derivable in my system. Okay, so this relationship holds. So basically, I mean, in a way, then INF iota is a subsystem of my system. Okay, we have to be a little bit cautious here, but sort of, in a way, that's the case. So, in my system, though, the equivalence of the F is G with the is exactly one F and is G means that adding the binary quantifier to negative intuitionistic free logic doesn't increase the expressive of the logic. So the binary quantifier is definable, namely just by there is an X, F, and for any Y, Fy implies X equals Y and G. Negative free logic is therefore very Russellian in this respect. So Russell, okay, you can't see this online, but there's a picture of Russell over there, so thank you, Russell. So it's very Russellian in this respect. And in fact, G of iota x F is equivalent to Russell's analysis if G is atomic, also in Tennant's system. Okay, so it's, again, there's a very clear analogy between all these systems. But in positive free logic, the situation is very different, because here the idea is that atomic sentences can be true even if some terms occurring in them, including the definite descriptions, do not refer. And this means that the Russellian equivalence shouldn't hold anymore. So we cannot analyze VFSG in Russell's way anymore if we adopt positive free logic. The proof that shows in my system that I x f comma g is equivalent to the Russellian formula doesn't actually appeal to any rules for identity or atomic denotation. And what this means is that if I add the rules that I've given you earlier to positive free logic, then the equivalence also holds in positive free logic. Okay? So nothing, the equivalence, given my rules, nothing in the equivalence is particularly positive free logic. Or negative free logic. Okay, so we've got the rules, you can add them to positive free logic if you like. The equivalence, Russellian equivalence still holds. But this means that it's not really in the spirit of positive free logic. Okay, so because in positive free logic, the idea was the FSG can be true if there's no F. If there's no unique F, so if F doesn't exist, or if there's more than one F. That was the idea in Lambert at least. Okay, so basically adding my rules to positive, you can, if you like, add my rules to positive free logic, but it doesn't really give you anything particularly interesting. So what we need is different rules. In positive free logic, with an iota operator, we have the following equivalence. If VF is G and VF exists, then that is the case if the Russellian sentence holds, and conversely. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the biconditional, we need to add that VF exists, so unique F exists. My proposal then was, in earlier work, I proposed to exploit this kind of equivalence when we translate it back to my system with the binary quantifier. So exploit the following equivalence, or lay down the following equivalence. VF is G, and VF exists, holds if and only if VF is unique and it is G. So you see that we need the existence assumption on the left hand side of the biconditional. That's where the difference to Russell comes in. And so exploiting this equivalence, exploiting that equivalence gives you quite complicated rules for the iota for the binary quantifier I, and the resulting logic is very weak. So you'll see them on the next slide. There are so many rules that don't fit easily on the slide, but I had to make this smaller, so you'll see it on the next slide. But they do take to heart, if you like, the logic's very weak, but they do take to heart something that Hintikka and Lambert both declare. What they want to have is that free logic should be silent on improper definite description. So where a definite description isn't fulfilled, where there's either no F or more than one F, then logic shouldn't say very much about the F. Okay, so it should stay largely silent, they say. They're quite explicit about this. So, with my rules, in fact, we are very quiet about them. Whereas Lambert and Hintikka still want to say that VF equals VF, even if VF is improper. In my system that is to follow, that doesn't hold. So the formula IXF, IY, Fy x equals y fails to be proven. So there's the analog of the law of self-identity doesn't even hold. So we are really very quiet about improper definite descriptions. In fact, if you look at the equivalence 8 in 8, if VF doesn't exist, so if we haven't got the second conjunct in the left-hand biconditional, we cannot. There's nothing we can deduce. Yeah? Oh, we know it. Okay, then we know that VF is G, but the logic itself doesn't tell us anything more. VF is G, that's it. But in order to use that in a deduction, we need that VF exists, actually. So you can see this is very, very weak. So here goes. The introduction rule is still exactly the same as the one we had before. Then we've got the following fast elimination rule, and that is exactly, it's like the elimination rule for the binary quantifier I had earlier, except that we add in the middle between ft and the c, we add that t exists. Okay, that basically what these two premises in the deduction. But the one premise t exists and the deduction of a equals t from f of a and a exists means that this means that t exists, and then we can deduce c from iota from ix, f, and g. Okay, under certain conditions. We then have two further elimination rules. Again, the third elimination rule corresponds more or less to this exact extension quantifier elimination. If we need to say something about if the f exists, then we also need to say something about what happens, what we can do if the f is identical to t. And we've got two rules that basically tell us under which conditions, again, take the a, forget about the a of t1 and replace the conclusion by t1 equals t2. It tells us under which two terms are identical, the conditions under which two terms are identical. And they look, again, exactly, one rule is more or less exactly the one we had earlier, except that we always have the love. So the two rules are like the ones we had earlier for I, except that now we replace G by the existence predicate or by an identity. So this is quite complicated. These rules are quite complicated. Yeah, I'm not going to go into many details anymore, but you can see, point being, I put a lot of effort into finding a system for the binary quantifier that works for positive free logic. That's what I came up with. It's a bit complicated, but let's say it's interesting. Okay, so now suppose we add these rules to positive intrinsic positive free logic. It has desirable proof theoretic properties, in particular deductions normalize. The theory of definite, here I said it's not, didn't say interesting, I said it's original. Okay, the theory is original. I didn't try to be original, but actually it is, because I couldn't reconstruct what the system that is what Hintecker and Lambert would have preferred. It takes to heart the doctrine of Hinteckers and Lamberts that logic should remain silent about improper definite descriptions. Okay, so the rules for I were found by exploiting a certain equivalence that holds for formulas with iota terms in the cases where everyone agrees on the correct analysis, the proper definite descriptions. So Hintecker and Lambert say, well, logic should remain silent about improper definite descriptions, but where they are proper, we all agree. Where a definite description is proper, we all agree that Russell is right. So my aim was to reconstruct something like Hinteckers and Lambert's views with my binary quantifier, but what I got was still quite different. It's rather different from Hintecker and Lambert. But I think, okay, so it does take to heart what Hintecker and Lambert say. It's in their spirit. The spirit is there, but not the letter. Okay? But even I have to say the rules are excessively complicated, and so I think it's worth looking for something simpler. And here we are back to my rules for negative free logic. Okay, and now note the existence assumptions in the rules. In the induction rule, we assume that T exists, and we're permitted to discharge certain existence assumptions. In the fast elimination rule, again, we are allowed to discharge certain existence assumptions. And in the second elimination rule, again, we assume that T1 and T2 exist. So there are all these existence assumptions being put into my rules, and that's the reason why they are exactly, they give us exactly the Russellian analysis in negative intrinsic free logic and also in positive intrinsic free logic. So what you can do now, I thought as well, there's really not much we can do if you want to modify these ones for positive free logic. So these rules really are in the spirit of negative free logic. So how do we modify them to get something in the spirit of positive free logic? Well, there's really only one thing. Drop the existence assumptions. And then we get some very simple rules, and I'll give them to you in a minute. So what distinguishes positive from negative free logic is that truth or assertability is not dependent on terms having reference. Atomic sentences may be true even if some of their terms do not refer. And that is supposed to apply to definite descriptions too. When they are formalized by a binary quantifier in the context of complete sentences, this means then that the existence assumptions made in negative free logic should be relaxed or altogether given up. Okay, so moving from negative to positive free logic and building into the logic the spirit of positive free logic into the rules, we should just give up these existence assumptions. And we haven't got many options for the rules. So we need to drop the existence assumptions of the introduction rule. Then the unique existence of an f is no longer required for the f is g to be derivable. All we need is uniqueness. We should also drop the discharged existence assumption in the fast elimination rule, which mirrors that of the existential quantifier elimination rule. And in the second elimination rule for the binary quantifier, we've got two symmetric existence assumptions. So if one goes, both go. And again, these mean that the identity of T1 and T2 no longer depends on their existence, but the uniqueness of them still follows. So what we get are the following rules, and they really are very simple now. VF is G can be deduced if T is an F, it is the unique F, and it is G. Now, we need to have a little bit of, we need to be a bit cautious here. When I say T is, I don't mean T exists, okay? So we need to allow ourselves a certain luxury in speaking about being without existence, okay? So the elimination rule then is just like the existential quantifier elimination rule for classical logic actually, except that it's basically the rule for there isn't X, it's F and G. And the second elimination rule, again, forget about the C, replace in the conclusion C T1 by T1 equals T2. So if VF is G, T1 is an F and T2 is an F, then T1 equals T2. These are my rules for positive free logic for the binary quantifier. These rules are simple and straightforward, and they're motivated by considerations characteristic for positive free logic. Negative free logic takes on Russell's analysis that the occurrence of a definite description VF in a sentence indicates the existence and uniqueness of an F. To modify this to suit positive free logic, there's then really only one option: give up the requirement of existence. What we keep then is uniqueness, and that makes sense. With VF is G, we aim to speak of only one F, whether it exists or not. And that's the effect of giving up the existence assumptions. Again, because that's what we do, IPF, editor IPF, my rules permit normalization. Very nice. But it does go against a cherished view of free logicians. Lambert thinks that VF is G can be true not only if there's no F, but also if there's more than one. And in my system, that's not the case. So here are a few properties of my operator I in positive free logic. We immediately get an analog to the formula dx. Vt is identical to t, which is a Lambert's second axiom. That's immediately derivable. So an analog of that is immediately derivable. So Vt is identical to t is logically true. That's desirable because it's an important principle for Lambert, but he has to add it as an axiom. We get this for free. We get an analog of 1/2 of Lambert's law. Okay, that we can deduce. We can deduce that if VA is identical to B, then B is the unique A. That's the deduction here. We don't get the common bias because the quantifiers in free logic are restricted to existing objects, so it may well be that B is the unique existing A, so that is all X A if and only if X equals B. But that doesn't imply that B is the unique A. Okay, so the unique existence of an A is not sufficient for VA equals B, because there might also be a non-existent A, in which case VA equals B must be false, according to me. So we get only 1/2 of Lambert's law, but I think that is justifiable and it makes sense. Again, we have a new theory of definite descriptions. Okay, so the semantics, this is the semantics. I'm not going to go through all the details here. The important part is clause 5 here. That gives you the semantics. If you use the standard semantics for free logic, where you've got two domains, one the inner domain, over which the quantifiers range, and the outer domain, over which, where terms can still refer to object in the outer domain, they don't exist, then we get the following. VF is G is made true by a structure A with a function assigning objects in the domain or in the outer domain to the variables. That is the case if and only if there's exactly one element in the domain of A, such that A satisfies A with S modifies. Yeah, okay. Sorry, this is a bit complicated. But if and only if there's exactly one F in the domain of A, so not in the domain of the model, not in that part of the domain of the model over which the quantifiers range. So if there's exactly one element in the domain, such as A satisfies A with S modified to assign that element to X, and A satisfies B with the same modified S. Okay, so basically it means if there's one and only one element, oh sorry, it's a typo actually, the A should be F, or the F should be an A. That's a typo, I'm afraid. So basically what this means is the binary quantifier, VFSG, picks out a unique object. So it's true if and only if there's a unique object in the domain of the model, which is also G. But it doesn't have to be in the inner domain of the model. So my object doesn't have to exist. Okay? If there's a unique F or unique A, but it doesn't need to exist. That's clause 5. That's what clause 5 tells you.
And the B should be a G, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I need to change that. Yeah, that was because I like to say the F is G following Bertie, and then sometimes, of course, you speak generally. You use A's and B's, so that's the thing. Yeah. So basically, the binary quantifier allows you to speak about the domain of the model, whereas the existential quantifier, the universal quantifier, only allow you to speak about the inner domain of the model. Okay, so that's the semantics for my binary operator. And now a few thoughts on modal logic, because that's where I think that is where the real interest of definite descriptions comes in, where we have such a thing as scope distinctions. Okay, so everyone agrees that scope distinctions must be drawn in modal logic. So Aristotle's teacher is necessarily a son of Ariston. He was speaking dire, and if you accept the necessity of origin, this sentence is true. Okay, Plato was a son of Ariston, and so he couldn't have been anything else. That's necessary. And he happened to be Aristotle's teacher. But contrast with, it is necessary that Aristotle's teacher is a son of Ariston. That's false, because Aristotle may have had a teacher who is not a son of Aristotle. And here's just to demonstrate how the binary quantifier allows us to draw this distinction very perspicuously, I think. VF is necessarily G, that's the Dirac version, and necessarily ZF is G, is the Dedictor version. So we've got either the box applying directly to G or to the entire form. So that's a very nice way of drawing the distinction. And here's again the truth conditions for the binary quantifier. So applied now to modal logic, what we get is that VF is G is true at a world W if and only if there's a unique D in the inner or outer domain of W that is F and it is G. So every world now gets assigned an inner domain of objects that exist at the world, and the outer domain is basically the domain of the model. So the union of the domains of all the worlds in the model. Okay, so we can speak, again, it's the idea, we can speak with the definite descriptions about things that don't exist at a world. That's the thought. And the rules now have to be restricted to rigid terms. Okay, so in my introduction rule for the binary quantifier I, T must be rigid. Okay, so I can only conclude that the F is G if for a rigid designator T, I know that F is a T, it is G, and it's unique F. And similarly, there's no terms occurring here. And similarly, in the second elimination rule, I need to assume that T1 and T2 in VF is G. So I have VF is G, and I have for two rigid terms T1 and T2, I know that F of T1 and F of T2, then I can conclude T1 equals T2. Why? Well, I give you an example, which is so there's a very nice discussion by Pavel Tichy on necessity and existence and an analysis of the ontological proof of the existence of God. And here I'll give you, what I do is I'll modify his example to show you why in the introduction rule first we need to restrict this to, the term T needs to be restricted to rigid terms. So here goes. The sovereign is a non-rigid designator of the monarch of the United Kingdom. Last year around this time, the sovereign was Queen Elizabeth II. Today, it is Charles III. Now what we have is that this sovereign is monarch of the United Kingdom is true, and anyone who is monarch of the United Kingdom is identical to the sovereign. Yes, we've got the uniqueness. rules of accession to the British throne mean that the role of the sovereign is always occupied. So basically, when the Queen died last year, so allegedly this is how it goes. The Queen is dying, then there are a couple of people standing around her, and her personal physician at some point declares that the Queen is dead. And then he says, the Queen is dead, and everyone else chimes in, and Charles is present at this moment, and everyone says, long live the King. At that moment, Charles was king. Okay? So the moment the Queen is pronounced dead, Charles was king. So the role of sovereign is always occupied. So this means that it is constitutionally necessary that someone is identical to the sovereign. So the premises of the introduction rule are fulfilled. Okay, so the sovereign is monarch of the United Kingdom is true. The sovereign is the unique monarch of the United Kingdom. And we've got the second premise, that it is constitutionally necessary that someone is the sovereign. But it's not the case that the monarch of the United Kingdom is such that it is constitutionally necessary that someone is identical to him. Okay, so Charles III doesn't exist by constitutional necessity. Okay, so I don't know whether Charles would object, but clearly it doesn't exist by constitutional necessity. So the premise in one, it is constitutionally necessary that someone is identical to the sovereign. That's de dicto. The conclusion here, it is de re. So if you look again at the rules, we have so T is the sovereign, F is monarch of the United Kingdom, and G exists by constitutional necessity. Okay? Then it is true that necessarily the sovereign exists, but it's not true that the sovereign necessarily exists. Okay, so you've got exactly the shift from de re, from de dicto in the premises to de re, attribution of necessity in the conclusion. So that's why we need to restrict T to rigid terms. Another example of T-sheets. Suppose that some things in some worlds are ordered from most miserable to most awesome. So that there's always the most miserable thing, and always a most awesome thing in the world. And we'll call the latter its awesomeness, and the former its miserableness. Now, then what we have is that it is necessary that its miserableness exists. Okay, in every world there is something most miserable. And it's also true that it is necessary that its awesomeness exists. Okay? So in every world there's something that is most awesome. Now, clearly they don't need to be identical. They could be identical sometimes, but they need not be. So let's pick a world in which its awesomeness is different from its miserableness. Now let's also assume that amongst these things we've got in these worlds, there's exactly one that exists in all of them. And in W, it is mediocre. So then what we have is that the necessarily existing thing is mediocre is true at W. What property it has actually is irrelevant, so this doesn't matter. That just shows mediocre because we talk about being miserable, being awesome, and so something's mediocre fits that example. But it doesn't really matter what you say. In that case, the premises of the second elimination rule are fulfilled, but its conclusion isn't, okay? Because its awesomeness, okay, T1 equals C2 is false because its awesomeness isn't identical to its miserableness. And if F is necessarily F of X, then we've got necessarily its awesomeness exists, necessarily if its miserableness exists, the two premises Ft1, Ft2. We also have that the thing that exists necessarily is mediocre, but we don't have that its awesomeness is identical to its miserableness. So that's why we need to restrict these rules to this rule also to rigid designators. So I'm pretty sure that that'll work. I haven't proved this yet. So the system, given the semantics, the system is sounded complete for the non-modal case. I'm pretty sure, so I've got a sketch of the proof. I'm pretty sure this works in the modal case. I haven't worked it out, but that's the next step. That's the next step I'm going to do in my research to prove that actually adding these rules to a system of modal logic, giving the semantics in detail, that'll work. So the restrictions to rigid terms, that's necessary and also sufficient to get a sound and complete system. But I haven't proved this, but I'm pretty sure this works. Okay, and so to conclude, here's we have already. Okay, again, in the premises we're speaking modalities, having modalities de dicto, and the conclusion is de re. So again, while the second example shows the necessity of restricting terms to rigid terms, is again the same thing, the shift from de re from de dicto in the premises to de re in the conclusion. And so so my system is, I think, interesting. It has some of it's in the spirit of free logic, positive free logic. It's interestingly, it can be added to modal logic in an interesting fashion. It gives you very useful formalization of definite descriptions in modal logic. But I'll give you a little, a closing remark, a bit of a thought. And I'd like to hear what you think. So, consider the following sentence. The most famous musketeer might have challenged an agent of Cardinal Richelieu's to a duel. Now, one might say, D'Artagnan is the most famous musketeer. So maybe then you'd like to say that Charles de Batz, the Castlemore D'Artagnan, that's the guy on whom the novel by Dumas, The Three Musketeers, is based. This man was unlikely to have challenged an agent of Cardinal Richelieu's to a duel, but you might say, well, the novel by Dumas is kind of, so it's kind of an alternative way in which Charles de Batz's life could have panned out. And in the novel, D'Artagnan challenges the Comte de Rochefort to a duel, who's in fact an agent of Cardinal Richelieu. Of course, he also challenges the Three Musketeers to duels. They show up, of course, the Three Musketeers show up to the duel, but the Comte de Rochefort is a coward and not a gentleman. He doesn't show up, he just sends his agents. So anyway, that's the beginning of the story. And you might say, okay, good, so my sentence, the most famous musketeer might have challenged an agent of Cardinal Richelieu's to a duel, is true simply because the novel describes a possible alternative course of Charles de Batz's life. Now, according to my theory, however, star is false if the following is accepted. The fictional D'Artagnan is certainly a most famous musketeer. I think everyone would agree. The fictional D'Artagnan is a most famous musketeer. But presumably, this makes the real D'Artagnan also a most famous musketeer, because the story was based on the real D'Artagnan. So there's no unique most famous musketeer, and hence, according to my theory, star must be false. Okay, so the moment, in my theory, the moment a predicate A is satisfied by two things, no matter whether they exist or don't exist, the moment that happens, any sentence the FSG is false. So according to my theory, the sentence star, if you accept, okay, you can explain this away maybe, but think about it structurally. So maybe you can explain this away. Actually, the real D'Artagnan isn't that famous because hardly anyone knows that it was this guy. But take it structurally. So if you accept that these two figures, the real and the fictional D'Artagnan, are both most famous musketeers, then sentence star is false. So the moment you've got a predicate F being satisfied by one thing that exists and another thing that doesn't exist, any sentence of the form DFSG, according to me, is false. So the more I think about it, the more I can live with it. But I leave this to you. And here is something I need to say at the end. This research was funded by the European Union, so and anything I say, they will deny responsibility for any claim I have just made. Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll end